Back at the end of 2016, Retrobit released a highly ambitious, yet highly flawed plug-and-play console known as the Generations. At the end of 2017, they tried one more time with another one called the Super Retro-Cade. Let's see if they learned from their mistakes this time. If you're not already familiar, the Super Retro-Cade is an emulation-based console. It runs a version of Android in the background of a simple user face of their own design, and using emulation is a great way to cover a wide variety of formats, but that also means they're probably not going to be without their bugs, since they're basically backwards engineering this stuff to work on one bit of hardware. And when they released the Generations last year, or should I say a little over a year ago now, it had a lot of issues with frame rate and slowdown, and it just wasn't pretty. Hopefully this time around they fixed some of those issues. The Super Retro-Cade boasts over 90 games from a wide variety of publishers, including Capcom, Data East, Jaleco, Technos, and Irem. The library consists of a mix of home and arcade titles. It would take me months to probably put every single game through its paces, but I think I've gotten a good once-over to a sizable portion of the library for this video. The console is very much like its predecessor, just in white this time. Also, instead of the Sega Genesis style 6-button controller, it comes with a pair of controllers similar in style to their Super Retro Super Nintendo controllers. I'll talk a bit more about those controllers later. The console is just a simple little box, 2 USB ports on the front, a power button on the top, jacks for HDMI, composite, power supply on the back. The back also has an SD card slot for game saves, among other things, and yes, I will be getting into that later as well. Having played probably close to half the games on the Super Retro-Cade, I am pretty confident that they did fix a lot of the issues that they had with the Generations. I'm actually quite impressed with the emulation on this console. Its performance is much better than the Generations by far. Even things which you can emulate on nearly anything like the Sega Genesis or the Nintendo Entertainment System was a little bit rough on the Generations. The Genesis version of the Capcom game Quirks was practically unplayable on the Genesis. Here, Quirks plays and looks a heck of a lot better. Not that Quirks was all that good of a game to begin with, and that's a good reason why they also put the arcade version on here as well. There are a few instances where both an arcade game and its home port are on this console, and it's kinda neat to get to compare them for yourself. And speaking of arcade games, that's what makes up the bulk of the library on this machine. If not emulated versions of the original games, you'll find ports of arcade titles. Some games on here might not even be arcade games, but might have been console-exclusive sequels or prequels to an arcade title. One thing I always enjoy about collections and compilations of games, especially when you're talking about collections of arcade games, are the games that I've never seen before. An interesting example of this for me is Exciting Hour, the Pro Wrestling Network, a Technos arcade game from 1985, which did see the light of day in the US under the name MacMania, but I was never familiar with it until now. This game is clearly a forerunner to games like Pro Wrestling on the NES. Being a fan of wrestling games, I pretty much had to check this one out. It's fairly primitive, but not bad. Past the arcade titles, there are Super Nintendo, NES, and one lone Genesis game which I have already mentioned. The only games with any noticeable issues are a couple of arcade titles, but even those are still very playable. That said, the system as a whole is not without a few quirks. Not all the games have an intuitive control mapping layout by default, so it may be beneficial for you to check the menus before starting your game up, just to check on those controls before playing. Another one of those quirks is that all the games default to a stretch screen ratio, meaning if you want to play the games in their original aspect ratio, you have to set it in the menu before you play. In a number of cases, games were designed for vertical arcade monitors, so the screen size in its original aspect might look a bit small on some games, but it still looks way better than having them stretched completely out of proportion. Now that you got your game picked out and everything set up where you need it, let's talk about the controller. Retrobit have been making some really good controllers over the last few years, and this is no exception. Like I said earlier, this is very similar to a lot of their Super Nintendo style controllers that they've been making lately. I guess Nintendo's restored their copyright or patent, whatever they had on Super Nintendo controller for the SNES Mini, so they went with this, and it's a great design, albeit a little small. I would have preferred something with a little more mass. I'm not talking Xbox Duke or anything, but just a little bit bigger would have been nice for me. That said, I still really like this controller, and once you get used to it, you probably will too. And another thing Retrobit is very well known for is having really long cables. I'm talking this is like a 10-footer, and that's a huge plus when it comes to your wired controllers. You probably have already heard that it's really quite easy to play ROMs from the SD card of the console. I'm not going to go into details as to how, as there's plenty of other videos that already do. All I'm going to say about it is just because you can load games onto the SD card, it doesn't mean they're going to work. I've tried several games with some very mixed results. A number of them were not recognized at all, and you can clearly see by the rough frame rate of this clip here of Golden Axe: The Return of Death Adder, it will sometimes run them just really poorly. Retrobit has been working with a number of different companies to make things like this console, and even new cartridges for old original game systems available, and I think all of that is really neat. And they also make some really good hardware. I've already talked about their controllers, which have come a long way in the last, let's say, 5 years or so. I remember trying out a Retrobit controller very early on in this channel and not being all that impressed with it. And if they continue to learn from their mistakes, it's going to be a very good thing. Now, what do you think of the Retrobit company as a whole? I know they've done some interesting stuff in the past, and some of it is a little bit questionable. I mean, we've already talked about the generations. And also, what games on this or other stuff that Retrobit is producing interest you the most? Leave a comment down below. Hope you've enjoyed the review. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Take care.